half an hour. Okay. Great. Yeah. So I'll try to go fairly quickly today. We've had a lot of really interesting talks about how to process data that you might have. You also sometimes might not have this data just because your question doesn't have data for yet. And that's, I think, myself as a biologist and a lot of you as ecologists, often you don't have data. And we're going to discuss how you can get data, especially with DIY hardware. And I first will talk a little bit about my background because I'm actually a biologist. I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not an engineer, and I think maybe you can relate that with the fact that you can yourself build some hardware, build some software. So the first time I started playing with images is I was working on insects. This is my background. I studied insect physiology, and I was studying how bacteria evolve whilst they're infecting insects. And in the end of the day, I had to plate a lot of bacteria, and those colonies grow on these agar plates. And back in the days, what my boss told me to do is to sit down and count by hand these hundreds of plates. And it's just something I didn't want to do, so I really instead spent all of the time working on the software that is still used today, OpenCFU, that is a sort of a pre-deep learning type of image processing to count colonies. And then I found a PhD where I could actually use both the insect physiology and some of the image processing I had learned throughout. And that led this project was on sleep in fruit flies, so quite neuro, a little bit of lab work, and really understand what happens to fruit fly during the night, this sort of things. But for that, I also had to learn something new, which was how to acquire images of many fruit flies at the same time. And we built this tool called the ethoscope that I'll describe a little later. And then during my postdoc, I continued building some hardware, but this time to track insect in the field, building smart insect traps. And then I moved on to my current position, where I studied a group on digital approaches for resilient and sustainable agriculture, where we continue building both software and hardware to tackle biological questions on organisms that people don't really look at often, like earthworms or small plants like duckweed and so on. But then if you go back to this question, why would you build DIY and what is around? And if you look at the literature in ecology, you'll see that a lot of authors actually end up building things to acquire the data. So you have, for instance, on the top left, cameras mounted on cars to detect invasive species. You can have cameras mounted on animals. You can have people who study, who build their own microscopes because they want something low cost and so on and so forth. So altogether, DIY hardware seems to have tackled a lot of different scales and organisms, different kind of questions. And yet today we'll start with a discussion, a quick one hopefully, on why do we want to build DIY, why sometimes we want to avoid it, and what are the considerations, how do we start? So we'll go through the discussion and we'll conclude with kind of starters on implementation, on things you can do next week if you want to get started on building your own hardware. But why does it matter, really? You could just get images, but in the end, data, as we've seen today, is crucial, and how you get data is actually perhaps one of the most important things for you. And often, if we know a little bit of image processing, machine learning, we kind of want to apply what we know to the system. But sometimes the simple fix, the simple solution is to use a hardware problem. So for instance, if you're trying to sort dead and live cells, you can train an algorithm to do it from the morphological features. Or you can just dye these cells with a dye that has been shown to show dead or alive cells. And often, if you pick the right hardware, the right procedure, you actually don't need much deep learning at all. I still want us to do some, but sometimes you just don't need to. Something more philosophical maybe is that hardware, actually, the choice of hardware contains hypotheses. and we've seen that for the trees, for instance, we think that the data is complete, but perhaps if you acquire a different type of data, for instance, hyperspectral, maybe you have more complete data. And then you also imply that your hardware itself does not affect the system in most cases. It's not always true, for instance, when you use light in ecology. And then there is an epistemic or epistemological value itself in hardware. I put this picture because you know the saying that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and it's very much like that for hardware, where sometimes the methods shape the science and not the way around. So often we think of science like you have a question, you build a method to answer your question, and that's it, Bob's your uncle. Sometimes knowing a method is available helps you build a new question that hasn't been addressed before, and hardware is also there for that. So I try to make this more of an interactive workshop. We'll see how it works. But I'd like to kind of think for yourself, and it won't be 2 minutes because we're running out of time, I understand. But
15 seconds.
Think about examples of DIY in the context of computer vision and ecology, and what did you make yourself? What did you build yourself? Does anyone want to share what is something they've built? Ben?
We had to make a drone this year because they have outlawed Chinese drones.
This is great.
That's the point.
Yeah, we have our own supply chain as well, so this is good. Yeah.
We're working on multimodal stimuli with combining audios and visions.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Thanks.
We're ready to synchronize with our visual stimulus.
Thanks. Any last?
I just used a very simple camera setup with a camera on a repro stand attached to a computer, which would take just images faster than a phone or
Thanks.
something like that. So
Okay, fabulous. So we've had a little bit of what I think is a spectrum of DIY, and if you compare it with something, if you're like me, a little bit of a fabric nerd, and you like making your own clothes or fixing clothes, you see that there is actually a spectrum of what we say is DIY. You can buy your clothes off the shop, it's made for you, or you can completely make it from the raw fibers. And you have anything in between, you can knit it, or you can darn it, or whatever. It's the same with hardware. No one's going to expect you to make your own sensor from scratch, right? But in the end, it kind of releases a little bit of pressure because you don't have to be an engineer. You could just fix something that someone else made, and it's also okay. It's also DIY. And that includes things like making cases, making fixtures, mounts, or just changing the lenses, or putting a different illumination, or using filters, or this sort of things. But you can go further and make things move, use actuators, motors, and so on. Or you can integrate different things that work, but put them together, like putting multiple cameras together. You can also repurpose things that already exist, like a GoPro. We've seen a few things, a baby monitor, pet tracker, all these things. If there is a large market, why not use them? Okay, another interactive part. So you have, most of you, a neighbor, someone you can talk to about what are the reasons, why, if you could come up with bullet point reason of why would you actually build a hardware? Why would you decide in the beginning of a project that you want to build something rather than take it off the shelf? Go on, talk to your neighbor. Okay, so we restart. Thanks. I've never done this interactive thing. I'm taking a pedagogy course and they say, this is great, you should try it. So I'm giving it a go. Let's see how it goes. So, does anyone want to share kind of a single word bullet point reason why you want to build your own hardware? Yeah?
It's mindless fun.
It's fun. It's a good reason. Yeah. Anything else?
It can be cheaper.
Cheaper, yeah. That's great.
Didn't exist before.
Yeah. Novelty. Okay.
I don't want to do it manually.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, that makes sense.
Makes your life or the animal or plant's life easier. You don't disturb them as much.
Yeah. So that's also kind of novelty type of. Yeah.
It does exactly what you want.
When it works, yeah.
Say when and not if.
Yeah. If you keep going, it will work. Yeah. When you don't run out of funding. Any last reason? Okay, so I think I've captured some of these reasons. We'll go over quickly. So the thing doesn't exist, exactly what you said. It's pretty simple. You're making something new. Cost, we've mentioned that it could be cheaper. It could scale better. It's not like it's costly, but it means that you could get just much more sensors, camera, whatever for the same price, and maybe that gives your work more power. Another thing I wrote down is maintainability. You can, if you know your hardware, you're in a better position to repair it or upgrade it. It could be almost an ideological reason or a teaching reason. You could say, I want to make it open source or to share it with the community, open hardware, and so on. The fun, I relate that to the learning as well. You can learn, you can have fun, but you also incidentally get closer to innovation. So if you tend to be in this nebulosa of hardware, often you're aware of new sensors. So even if they're off the shelf, you get to maybe use it for addressing a new question. Another thing I noticed is if you do anything in computer vision, a lot of people will come with problems with you before they start an experiment and will say, how do I get data? And you're sort of expected to know about data acquisition, which I think is fair. Okay, now another neighbor, and that's like the last, almost the last interaction piece. Talk about why you may want not to do any DIY, or you just want something that is off the shelf. Go on.
I tried to make one of these, it was pretty bad. I feel like sometimes you just between the tasks and somebody else has already done something. If not something like different levels somebody already
All right, let's keep the discussion short so we can maybe go through the material. So, do we have suggestions as to why you may want not to do it yourself? Yeah.
Time.
Yeah.
Liability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes sense.
Cost.
Yeah.
Reproducibility, so if it's on your building using
Yeah.
some standard.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
Interest or expertise.
Yeah. Yeah. Any last one?
Safety issues?
Safety issues, yeah. I like that. I never thought about that. It's not in the bullet points. Right. So, I mean, first and foremost, when they get put in, you captures there are often available alternatives. If like, how much work are you gonna spend making a drone? Why would you make a drone yourself?
Yeah.
If you're an ecologist or biologist, that's a lot of work. Sometimes it's about the scope. It's important when you start a project to think about, is it for you? Or is this need, like this novelty we're talking about, is it something that everyone else will find novel? Or is this just for your question? And if that changes the trade-off of whether you want to build it or not. I'm afraid. So time, resource, we captured that. Another thing that is more as a psychological thing is you feel like I do, like an imposter because you're not an engineer, you're not a computer scientist. So someone is going to look at what you built out of wires put there and here and think this is crap. And they will, but it's okay if it does the job. Yeah. Sometimes it's your interest. You don't care. You don't really care about this. This is not the person you want to be. You have other interests, and it's perfectly fine. Or it could be your supervisor interest. Another thing we captured is the fact that the supply chain might break. So you need to understand whether you can maintain this project beyond your position. You're a PhD student, postdoc, assistant professor. It doesn't matter. When you finish a project, if you don't maintain it, it will die. So what are the important practical considerations when we start a DIY project? You're going to make very early decisions that sometimes you go down the rabbit hole. You think it's easy, you make a hackathon weekend and you have a prototype that works, and then you need to transform that to something that works in the field or whatever. This is another 6 months of work you're committing to. So how do you make these decisions? I would say we think of DIY as do it yourself. Don't do it yourself. Find people and take criticism, and they will say don't do it, and sometimes it's better to hear them. Use workflows from engineering where you can, so there is this workflow called Moscow, for instance, and there are many others where you can prioritize things by Moscow is what your tool, that the thing you want to define, before you start coding or building or wiring thing, just think about what it should do. What it must do, what it should do, what it could do, and what it's definitely not going to do, what it won't do. So if you think about the specification before implementation, you'll save yourself a lot of time, a lot of effort. You're scoping your project. I thought I had 1 hour, so we're going to skip the toy case study because but we can come back to it if we have more time. Other more specific consideration, if we're talking of computer vision, is you want to be able to describe your project. So you're thinking of an idea. I want to build something. How do I define what it should do? Often it's about the resolutions. So the temporal and spatial resolutions you want to get data at. But it's also about the content, what you should be able to see. So on the image on the left, it's quite clear that given the problem, if your problem is to find the numbers on the number plate, you don't have enough. There is no, the resolution is not there, so your problem is intractable. Sometimes it could be as simple as viewpoints, like where do you put your camera? What does it look at? Do you want actually multiple cameras? It could be about what lights you use. A lot of the problems we have are related to lighting things, especially when you image small animals during day and night. You need to consider lighting and what is the color space you use. And then an important thing we've been hearing, for instance, from Sarah about multimodal aspects. So what additional data do you want to record? And again, just scope it. If you're not going to need temperature, don't say you're going to do it. And then there are, in addition to all these technical specifications, the logistical and experimental specifications, where do you just want to build one device? Say you want to build your own camera for the field, is it just one, or do you want to scale to 50? like, do you have a system where you have a singleton device, like a microscope or something, where the replication in your experiment comes from the fact that you're taking multiple plates and putting them in front of the microscope. But sometimes if you, for instance, have camera traps, the replication is more from cheaper devices that you distribute over space. So think about the scale, how many, and a lot of the projects are actually in between these completely singleton or distributed architectures. One thing that I think we start seeing more and more is something that is common in neurobiology but not too much in ecology, is like whether your device needs to process data in real time and whether it needs to actually do something with the processed data, like the secondary data. Is it a closed loop system? So a closed loop system is, for instance, a robot arm that has a camera and it can see what it is about to take, so it can be really useful. And I think in the context of computer vision, this is really interesting because vision is actually not passive. Like if you take an object, it's not like you have a stream of rays coming to you. You actually move your eyes and your eye is very dynamic. So there is interest in making systems closed looped. And then how are you going to interact with your device? Is it autonomous? Do devices communicate with each other? And so on. Do we have small questions so far before we move to more specific building blocks, tools we can use? Great. So how do we get started with building small things? Who has heard of Raspberry Pis here before? Who has used Raspberry Pis? Okay, thanks. So most of you have heard of them. They are a microcomputer. They can run an operating system. You can do basically everything you would do on a computer on a Raspberry Pi. They are a computer. And what's really interesting, and this is why you see it for a lot of not only hobbyist projects but actually scientific projects, is they have really good off-the-shelf cameras. And they are new cameras all the time. They're highly programmable, so it's like a computer. You can put the code you want in it. And those things, you can use them. They have been designed for kids. This is something that kids can learn. And we've had that in Outreach event, that you can teach basic computing or hardware to kids with a Raspberry Pi. So you can definitely learn it. Something really nice is that you can connect to them with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. And you can run basic machine learning on the board itself. So if you want to kind of see how this can apply to ecology, there is this good review paper and it would be recorded, or I can retrieve the reference for you. But it's really interesting to read about how different biologists have used Raspberry Pis. The cameras so of course, because it's a computer, you can use most cameras that you would use on a computer. In addition, there are built-in cameras. So I actually got, I forgot I had that. So I got a camera just to show you the size. This is the Raspberry Pi Zero, so it's kind of the smaller version. And this is the camera that's kind of bigger than the Raspberry Pi. And this one is the HQ camera. So it's pretty good. It has a sort of industry standard mount for the lens, so you can take the lens out. I shouldn't really risk doing that now, but this is so you can change the lens, and that means you can put telescopic lens, or you can adjust the focus manually, so that you can do all these things that you can do with proper optics. And then, because it's a widely distributed product, and there are lots of hackers, a big ecosystem, there are lots of other sensors and lenses and things you can get. So for instance, you can get cameras that don't have an infrared filter, so you can see pretty well objects using infrared light. You can have thermal cameras, you can have time-of-flight cameras, so you know the depth of objects. You can have cameras, obviously, that autofocus. And essentially, new cameras come every few months and are more and more interesting and amazing, and that make your past work look kind of bad. But you have better and better cameras. So this last one is 64 megapixel autofocus camera. It's 4 times more than I had. So don't necessarily run after the number of pixels, but there are really interesting options. And you can use multiple cameras at the same time. So that's also really interesting if you're looking, I mean, we have two eyes, and that actually works better than just one. You can use this principle when you're building your own hardware. And this is just to show you an example of something concrete I built in my PhD, if we can play it. So this is to show you the range of things you can do. So we wanted to see if fruit flies sleep. I'm not going to go in the why and the science today. I'll keep some for the keynote lecture. But we 3D printed these arenas. I'll go into 3D printing in a bit. And those are behavioral arena in which we can put little fruit flies. So we have a range of different arenas for different questions. And those are the fruit flies. We put them in those vials and we load them into the physical arenas. And then we want to observe them. Now we want to observe them for days and days, right? And they actually, they can live pretty well in those tubes for many days, and we want to take pictures consistently, like 2 times, 3 times per second, and assess whether they're moving or not, and if they're eating, if they're mating, and this sort of things. So we designed a system where we can load the arena, and it has a camera on the top. So it combines some laser cutting to make the wall and 3D printing, and it has a Raspberry Pi and a camera and some infrared lighting, so we can see them in their subjective night, what they think is the night. Then we really made a decision quite early on to have many devices that are inexpensive. It was like $100-ish or euro per device, but we would scale, and in the end we had 80 devices in the lab, and each device would have 20 flies. So that's the sort of thing we wanted to do, rather than one fruit flies we see extremely well. So we built a system with an internal network where we could monitor, retrieve the data, start all these devices together. So this is also something to consider, is what is the infrastructure to coordinate your devices if you build them yourself. So we made this web interface, and that gives us a little bit of feedback. And I'll jump to the last part. So this is when we track them here. Importantly, we track them in real time. So each of the Raspberry Pis was doing some basic background subtraction to know what is the fly blob. And that's as good as we could do on these devices. And here is an example of why would you want a closed loop system. So not only were we able to track them in real time, but we were wondering what happens if you perturb their sleep a little bit. So we can monitor them, and whenever they doze, we actually give them a small stimulus. And for that, we build a module underneath that is actually able to deliver the stimulus by just turning little motors that move these bells, as you can see here. So this is, I think it's, yeah, so you can see this one. So it's moving them a little bit, gently. We're not torturing them too much. Right. But this is just one example, and there are so many cool projects in the literature. If you just write Raspberry Pi, ecology, something new will come every year. So there are microscopes so you can use them for microscopy. You can use them. One other thing we did is we put gas, and we were in the system, so we were able to deliver odors to the flies and see how they respond to the smell of apples when they're asleep or when they're not putatively asleep. There are lots of systems, and there are also camera traps that can be from simple to complicated. So on the left is more of a standard camera trap, on the right is a camera trap built also in Aarhus by colleagues to monitor moth in the night. So this is just a quick intro to Raspberry Pis. Do we have any questions specifically on Raspberry Pi? I need to speed up. So we're gonna go quickly to microcontroller. A Raspberry Pi is a computer. It's gonna be kind of overkill for a lot of things and it's slow. Sometimes you want to use microcontrollers, things like Arduino, ESP32, the Raspberry Pi called Pico. These are things that don't have really a real operating system. They do one task and they do it well. They do it fast. And that means you can control fine-grained things. So they also have very low power use and autonomy. They're often very small. And these days they connect quite well with Bluetooth and so on. So those are, for instance, if you have a washing machine, a microwave, these are using microcontrollers. They don't have a computer inside. Yeah? And they do their job really well, really robust. But you can't do too much image processing on board, although this is changing pretty quickly. And again, things like Arduino are fast to learn. There are papers about how to use Arduino in the field and even books. You can learn that. You can learn that this is for hobbyists. This is for kids. But recently we've seen quite a few camera models coming up. The one I started using a month ago just to see how well it works. It's a 2 megapixel camera and it's as big as that, right? It has a lot of features integrated on board and it's $13 for a camera, a microcontroller, a power regulator. So essentially you can scale your project extremely well and make something extremely uninvasive with this type of cameras. I'll just show quickly a video that I acquired with this camera just to see what you can or cannot do. So this is these are duckweed plants growing in a little chamber I built, and you don't need a really good picture to actually see them growing. So if you pay attention, this is over just a few hours, over 6 hours, and they're just slowly growing, and eventually they'll break. So this is for this type of problem, you don't need a Raspberry Pi. You could just acquire a picture for a fraction of the cost. That means higher scale. Another thing you can do, instead of building your own cameras, using Raspberry Pi camera and so on, you use off-the-shelf things when possible. And you can sometimes hack them. So you can actually, I've seen work on mobile phones. Like these have huge markets, so you have very good cameras. You can use a desktop scanner. If what you're studying is flat, and you can move it, put it in a desktop scanner. Why not? You can use things like security camera, home IoT solution. But again, think as with the DIY hardware, these things might just be superseded with another product. So even if you're using off-the-shelf products, just buy more than you need, or think about whether they're going to be discontinued. Whenever you're building a project, draw your project. Don't just start doing it. And there are lots of computer-aided design tools to help you draw things. These are becoming more and more usable. And use building blocks. Don't 3D print everything because you can 3D print it. If there are, for instance, if there is a commercial, this is a junction box. It's basically a box that is designed to be weatherproof, that has a clear window. Like, don't bother making something yourself if this is doing it, and you can never do something as good. So use things like junction boxes that are designed to, you can put wires in as well. I've seen great projects using things like Legos. Like, this is great for prototyping. You have that?
Yeah.
And then even if you build more involved, use building tools. Like, these are aluminum profiles that you can cut on demand and put together like big Legos. Then you can use things like 3D printing and laser cutting. So essentially, I bet you've seen that around. You can design a shape and make it. And it's going to take more effort and more time, but it can be customized. And laser cutting is essentially you have a surface and you cut in 2 dimensions something, and it just is what it is. When you're doing that, you need it to be reproducible. So if you're using computer-aided design, you can actually have technical drawings, and that means you can make it reproducible. But if you turn up to a workshop, for instance, in your university, you might have a workshop. you give them a technical drawing, they can help you in much better than if you say, I'd like something that does this and that. This is a tool, I won't have time for a demo, but this is called Onshape on the left. There are others like FreeCAD where it's pretty easy to learn how to draw something. And actually sometimes I just make it to draw figures that I don't want to build or print. It's just to make a nice figure for my proposal or whatever. So this is pretty good for drawing. The next part as an important consideration is illumination. Do not ever trust your own perception of color. I'm colorblind, so maybe it's easier for me to say that. But do not think that your organisms see what you see, and do not think your camera sees what you see. So always test with especially light intensity and spectra. So if you develop something in the lab you want to put in the field, subject it to plausible light intensity ranges that you might experience in the field. Again, for lighting, you can use off-the-shelf products like LED lights. There are lots of work for photography that you can use tools that are used in photography or build your own. Don't be scared of just soldering a few wires together. There are often, if you just use off-the-shelf thing, you can solder them pretty easily. And then often you want to diffuse the light. Like, it's also an important problem. How do you scatter the light for your experiment or in the field? Yeah.
How many slides do you have?
This is sorry.
We're closely over time, so
Okay.
there's one more shorter talk though.
Well, I can conclude quickly. When you work in the field, think about all these things. This is important. And like what we heard for software, you really want to test things. You want to have a testing platform, so you don't just deploy something, you can iteratively test it quickly. So instead of building your device, build a testing platform that helps you test your device. And then I'll just finish with that. Yeah?
Those are important.